Hello, everyone. It's Settlers Lament here, and I'm joined today by Benedict the XVII, Charlemagne, and Fritz Imperial. And today we're going to be discussing the role of religion in politics and in politics and narrative. This is somewhat of a continuation of the stream from last week, which we discussed nationalism and global narrative and that type of stuff. So yeah, there were several things that were discussed there, and also discussed in Benedict XVII's most recent video, which I'm sure every single person watching has seen. Yeah, so I think there's some interesting points to touch on here, and what exactly is the role of religion in building a narrative for the future. So yeah, everyone can do short introductions on this topic or just on yourself.
Sure, I'll start. Hi, everybody. My name is Benedict XVII. My channel's mostly religious, philosophical, and political musings. Thanks to Settler for setting up this stream, because I think the topic of religion and politics is particularly important, especially today. And to put it briefly, my position on this stream is that modernism, socialism, the cathedral, whatever you want to call the problem we face today, has to be primarily understood as an attack on two things. First, the concept of authority in general, and second, a specific attack on the authority of God as understood in the Christian religion. Therefore, any cogent response to modernism has to be primarily Christian.
All right, I'm Fritz Imperial. I also run a YouTube channel. You probably never heard of it. It's too cool for you. But I've been recently just trying to do different things. Like I've often gone on long hiatuses. I'm just trying to kind of figure out new video ideas and dealing with some personal stuff. But I should be able to get new videos out soon. Like I'm planning a video, I think, coming soon called Freedom is Freedom is Slavery, and kind of trying to turn Orwell's kind of fears inside out and actually explaining why, in certain ways, this sort of authoritarian statism actually has benefits to it. Not the way it is run now, but just the concept of authoritarianism itself is an idea I think is worth defending, at least from my view. But and I agree with Benedict as well, is that there's always going to be elites in society. It's just a matter of who the elites are, and I would currently like the cabal we have ruling us now, which are godless sociopaths, to be removed. But that's about a roundabout way of saying it.
Okay, I'll go next. So yeah, I'm Charlemagne. I mostly do a neo-reactionary channel. I don't really focus on religion much at all. I am I guess, reconverted Catholic is how you would put it. I was an atheist for a few years, but I was raised in the Catholic tradition. In my part, as far as religion goes generally, beyond even Christianity, I think the primary role it has to play in dealing with the problems of modernity is more of an internal role for personal development as opposed to an external political role. So I'm interested to get into this discussion for sure.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, I think that's a nice sort of outline of ideas on this topic. I am somewhat undecided on this topic, so I'm interested to hear the stuff that Benedict and the others have to say. I certainly do believe that, just on the baseline level, that religion has a role in the state. I'm not going to lib-cuck on this and claim that, say separation of church and state. That's a stupid leftist slogan. It's not an actual policy. I think, actually, speaking of NRX and Bug, one of his big insights from probably his second most well-known series of essays called How Dawkins Got Pwned, is the fact that the difference between politically, the difference between an intellectual tradition, between a religious intellectual tradition and a non-religious intellectual tradition, or to put it better, a theistic and a non-theistic intellectual tradition, is essentially meaningless when we're talking about politics. And it's that distinction that was invented in the Enlightenment to essentially outlaw the old form of intellectual traditions and to mandate the new forms of them. The idea that the idea that there's something more empirical about, say, progressivism compared to Catholicism is a superstition. There's at the very least, there's much more evidence for, say, the Trinity than there is that men can become women, because at the very least, there's anti-evidence for the prospect that men can become women. Where on theological concepts, there at least isn't. Many of them aren't blatantly impossible. But yes, so I do have a sort of base. So my basic point there is that I do have a sort of baseline support for the intertwining of state and religion. With that said, it's obvious in the entire West currently that things are incredibly irreligious currently, and I'm not quite sure how. I'm not quite sure what role religion can have in right-wing movements currently, if it can really, or in government in general. Because religion has been beaten back so much at this point.
Yeah, I think you really nailed the problem there. And this is one of the reasons why I think the primary role that religion generally, in our case is Christianity obviously, should play more of an inner role in developing your being as someone who will be able to perhaps provide leadership to the next generation or generations following us. And perhaps at that point, if we can actually, in some sense, vanguard the concept of religious tradition, even if in a small sect, we can potentially transmit that to people in the future who can actually bring it into politics proper. I think the problem now is we have a crisis both in culture and religion, and we can't look to religion to bolster culture or culture to bolster religion at this point, because both are in incredibly weakened states, and we kind of have to build both of them up in order to get any use out of either of them at this point for, I guess, reactionary purposes.
People need to be able to people need a new driving civilizational force, and I think that's definitely something Christianity, especially Catholicism, can provide, because what's going to be necessary is to completely upend people have to unlearn essentially the liberal framework that modern society operates under, because ultimately you could argue that in the end secularism is where it was always going to head, regardless if the founding fathers wanted to have some acknowledgement of God or not in America. People can argue whether or not they wanted to, but it seems like as it's happened, the liberal project has turned into hard secularism, in which saying we should be, treat all religions equally is really just code word for we hate Christianity. And I think Christianity needs to be freed from the shackles of liberalism and be unafraid to say that, no, we don't have to abide by liberal standards of morality. We have our own morality, and our morality is actually real, and we're willing to build our own civilization on top of yours, because liberalism is obviously starting to crack. I think, as powerful as it is, I think especially with what's been happening lately, it's shown that it's actually quite fragile in certain areas or in certain respects.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is actually something I was thinking about before the stream in terms of how to frame this. The problem with Christianity right now, especially the non-Catholic strands, is that it's incredibly liberalized and isn't really suited at the moment to be used in any sort of political development, especially if you use the I guess ultra Calvinist analysis from Moldbug and recognize that part of the problems of progressivism are of a pseudo-Christian nature, sort of this liberalized Christian nature, and that's a problem we need to deal with first before we can actually use Christianity in any useful political sense.
Yeah, I think I think the big problem there with Protestantism is just the fact that every single generation for Protestants can be a complete new council that they can reinterpret everything and reimagine it, because all they operate on is sola scriptura, and it literally allows them to reimagine their entire religion every generation. where what I've talked about this several times on this channel before, but one of the things that influenced me quite a bit to convert to Catholicism was just the fact that the two largest churches by far in Canada, the Anglican Church of Canada, the United Church of Canada, are completely progressive churches, pro-transgenderism, pro-gay marriage, all that type of stuff, pro-abortion. And I'm pretty sure we'll always have the based Protestant churches with us, the Southern Baptists and that type of stuff, that at least on social issues are consistent.
With the exception of race, those churches tend to be very cucked on race because, I just had to add it because this is what I originally started my channel on when I wasn't evangelical, and it's kind of the Trojan horse problem where they might be based on like sexuality and like abortion and everything, but like because a lot of it's baby boomer white Southern males that grew up at the end of like Jim Crow, they still have this massive sense of not Catholic guilt, but of white guilt. But no, I'm pretty sure those types of at least they are based on the more sort of core social issues. And I'm pretty sure that will always exist, but it seems pretty clear to me that the vast majority of Protestants are going to fall away from that, and have already fallen away from that fairly quickly. I remember I had a Seventh-day Adventist friend once, and he was really trying to sell me on how based and epic the Seventh-day Adventist church is and how socially conservative they are. I just went on their website and read their position on abortion, and like they weren't fully pro-choice, but they said some pretty lip-cuck stuff on there. Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's just within the Catholic Church and the Orthodox churches, the tradition is sort of a straitjacket that really constrains the progressives from being able to bastardize our churches the way that Protestants are, because we're not allowed to just completely reinvent the church every generation.
The problem is, of course, I said this before, is Protestants had a structure problem, but Catholics have a people problem in the sense that, well, we have the structures, and like the Catholic Church is just like, unlike Protestant churches, which can basically vote every synod to throw out parts of the Bible. Obviously, it's just it's like, I guess it's legally not possible. There's no possible way you could do that in Catholicism. The problem is you have far too many priests and clergy and Catholics and lay Catholics who just outright refuse to actually and enforce what the Catholic Church teaches. And like, we have a council of bishops that are completely unwilling to actually enforce Catholic doctrine and punish the priests that are leading the laity astray.
But go ahead,
because I wanted to say something on like specifically how on the church and the state is that the problem one of the problems that both Orthodox and the Protestant churches have is the fact that they were so intertwined with the state that essentially you have national churches in both Orthodox countries and Protestant countries that become reliant on the state. And essentially, if say, the roles could have been reversed, and like, what if Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and England were all hardcore right-wing, were a lot more right-wing and conservative than, say, Eastern Europe. I would imagine if like Russia and Romania and Greece became super liberal, Orthodox churches there would also reflect it. And so having specific churches that are reliant on the state or state churches is very much not a good idea, because they essentially will go wherever the state goes. And that's far more malleable than having, the Catholic Church being its own separate entity, but has its own influence upon state policy.
Yeah, that is actually something interesting from Catholic theology and history. Is the phrase separation of church and state actually was invented by Catholics in the Middle Ages, in a completely different context from how it's used today. But the phrase was originally developed to describe the fact that the state and the church has separate roles and separate functions to fulfill. But the Catholic understanding was also always that the church and the state should work together to ensure the common good and to promote faith.
Sorry.
Yeah, but the sort of difference between the Catholic and the Catholic understanding of how that worked out and the Orthodox and Protestant understanding of how that worked out was the Orthodox and Protestant churches were subordinated to the state, where the state or the monarchs were subordinated to the Catholic Church. like I mean, for example, I remember, I don't know who said this, but I remember one pope said once something along the lines of kings need popes, but popes don't need kings.
Mhm.
And also another similar situation is when King John, when he repented for the murder of Thomas Becket, by people who took it sort of on his command. It's a long story, I won't get into it. He said, who will rid me of this troublesome priest? And some knights went and murdered him. But according to the conventional histories, he didn't personally order it, but that's what happened. But after that happened, the Pope ordered him to go through a pretty severe public penance, where something like 100 monks and priests got to whip him in public. And the king. So that's it's sort of a reverse in roles between the Catholic and the traditional Protestants and the Orthodox.
Yeah, and in a way, it's because you can argue that like the subordination of the Orthodox patriarchs to the emperor in Constantinople helped. You know, I'm not that familiar with it, but I know that's an argument that's kind of what led them astray from Catholicism, you know, believing in papal primacy, because in the West you had I think there's actually is kind of I would actually disagree with the line from that Pope that said popes don't need kings, because in a way during the Dark Ages, post fall of Rome and pre say Norman conquest, the position the Catholic Church was in was basically to curry favor with whatever Germanic warlord would support them, because they needed some form of secular temporal power to reestablish a Christian order in the wake of the fall of Rome. And even after that, after Charlemagne and the establishment of the Holy Roman Empire, you had a continuous struggle between the Pope and the Emperor. But unlike in Byzantium, when the patriarchs basically were subordinate to the Emperor, it at least partially ended when Heinrich IV, I think in the 11th century, had to beg for forgiveness outside of Rome in the snow.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, no, that is true. I mean, that line is somewhat aspirational, not totally how it actually works out in reality, but it sort of, I think, shows the relationship that is at least ideally viewed in Catholicism, that the Pope is above, not below, secular powers.
And that's pretty common in pretty much any traditional hierarchy. But of course, we do live in the material world and have to deal with material concerns.
Yeah, it's actually that point of the material world that I was going to get to, because we've talked a lot so far about kind of religion in, as a utility within politics, but I wanted to kind of get at a fundamentally deeper question, which is essentially, how is the political attack on religion kind of related to the idea of materialism and modernism? And one way I think we can understand this is that in the pre-modern era, and I mentioned this in my last video, transcendence was understood as, essentially the difference between earth and heaven. Earth, you can understand earth in relationship to the transcendent order, to God. Meaning on earth is created in relation to God. In the modern era, that's where that changed. In a sense, even though you still had religion, it was very much desacralized. It became much more material. And the idea of transcendence, the idea of a heaven, the idea of the beatific vision was taken away, and transcendence became about the future, about making the future better. You have that in Moldbug with his idea of the Whig view of history, the moral arc of the universe always trends towards goodness or whatever. The idea is that the future took the place of heaven, so you got utopianism. And this had several consequences. The one being that whereas in the pre-modern era, politics was subordinated to ethics, in the modern era, and especially in the postmodern era, ethics is subordinated to politics, in the sense that what is right, what is good, what is bad, all these things are subordinated to and related to the question of how do we make the future better? How do we politically make the future better?
And of
And
course,
you see this in Hegel, but especially in Marx, and all the Marxists later on. Gramsci, in fact, had a famous line that was, whatever is good is that which aids the revolution. Whatever is bad is that which hinders the revolution. And in this way, violence can be justified in order to create our heaven on earth, our utopia.
So I think I'm actually reading a really interesting book right now called The Fourth Turning, which I think provides some insight into the problem you're looking at. And I think the problem with the replacement of a transcendent heaven with the material future has to do with this concept of linear time that actually came into being as a part of Christian metaphysics, essentially replacing the idea of cyclic time with a time that will have some particular endpoint, in this case, the coming of Christ. And this has instilled in a certain impulsion in people to try and create some sort of perfect order on Earth, given this concept that things can actually change permanently and be improved over time, as opposed to some sort of reset. So I think potentially one solution to our problems with this replacement of transcendence with these material ideas is a sort of not necessarily reversion, but appreciation for the concept of cyclic time versus linear time.
I actually would probably disagree with you there, because then that way, because I am somewhat of a fan of Hegel, but of course, he's notoriously difficult to read, so I can't always explain why I'm a fan of him, but in part is he was very much a non-materialist, and so him combining his idea of the dialectic, but not using it as materialism like Marx did, which is very bizarre. How Marx I want to know how Marx justified having a dialectic with materialism when Hegel was very much, it was the way he talks about like his love of like spirit and knowledge and everything and science and reason it's almost like he's like an Enlightenment version of a mystic, but there is an end of history with Christ, and you can't really get around that. But I meant more of this in the sense that I really dislike the idea of the cyclical view of history, because to me, it's like people that point this out basically think they can point to the fall of the Roman Empire and then think the exact same thing is happening the exact same way right now. And even if that was true, that's one example wherein you can look at countries that didn't actually have that, ironically, didn't have an end of history mindset, i.e. in the East, in that Japanese and Chinese civilizations really didn't change for thousands and thousands of years, and they didn't really go through China kind of went through a dynastic cycle, but the dynasty, even you could argue if you see the Communist Party as a continuation of a new dynasty, and the same thing with Japan, in the sense that they really haven't gone through this cycle. Neither has much of the rest of the world either. So I really kind of reject the idea of a cyclical view of history.
I think the cyclical view is more important from a generational or even individual perspective than of this sort of grand scale of civilizations.
Okay.
Because I think the linear view that people tend to have, I think, is sort of the cause of materialism, because it implies that any change we can make is permanent in some way, and that we can actually progress the human being. And I think this is what impels people to have such high material values, as opposed to if you have a more cyclical view of human nature, I suppose, or the internals of human civilization. You sort of inherently recognize that while things may or may not progress in some sense materially, but ultimately the human is bound by certain aspects of their own nature, of the human lifespan and seasons and whatnot, and you can't really fundamentally change that. And that isn't actually an element in Christianity, right? So Christianity, I don't think that Christianity should force upon us a linear view of material human progress, despite it having a sort of metaphysical end, right? I think these things are separable, and I think part of perhaps one path towards resolving this problem of disconnecting Christianity and liberalism is divorcing, applying this linear view to the actual lived human experience.
Mm-hmm. And I would say, go ahead, Benedict.
I don't think Christianity really has this idea of the material betterment of mankind through time. In fact, Tolkien, very much a Catholic. If in case someone didn't know, Tolkien had the idea of the long defeat of history. That history is just a continual saga of defeat. And we're basically holding back the forces of darkness until the king comes again, until the return of the king. We just have to hold on until Jesus Christ ultimately wins the battle.
Which is interesting because even in Lord of the Rings, it actually ends on a very sour note, doesn't it? Frodo's not ultimately able to bring himself to destroy the ring, and then evil is only destroyed by Gollum, ironically enough, basically evil and greed consuming itself. And you even get the idea, especially in the books, that the world of Middle-earth is still on that the defeat of Sauron was maybe it helped rekindle humanity for a little bit, but that ultimately, like, the magic of the world, especially with the loss of the elves, and that some sort of modernity is creeping in that almost can't be stopped.
So I don't think Christianity has a linear view of material human progress, but it does have a metaphysical linear view. And the problem with the human psyche is when you adopt that metaphysical linear view of time, you're going to act that out in the material world as well. And if you have this idea that you can incrementally build upon human civilization, and you're not subject to these sort of whims of nature and history, I think there's some sense in which you can understand how the progressive materialist view is sort of a natural byproduct of Christianity, even though it's not embedded in the metaphysics of Christianity itself.
Well, I think that actually is primarily a result. I wouldn't deny that has any that I wouldn't say that has nothing to do with Christianity, but I think that sort of Whig history is primarily a result of material changes that have happened in approximately the past 500 years. Because if you go back to any medieval society or any society really before the 1500s, there was a generalized understanding really anywhere, but in particular in Europe, but really anywhere on Earth, that your grandchildren and that your great-grandchildren and your great-grandparents would basically have the same life. That unless there's a really big disaster like the Black Death or something like that, that more or less their life and the structure of it would be pretty much the same.
If I can,
it's a quick point. But I think that this sort of idea of progress comes from the very rapid technological growth that has occurred over the past 500 years, and more and more rapidly, more and more recently. And I think it's very difficult for people to sparse out different types of progress. So when we see stuff like, say, infant mortality rates going to almost zero, basically, compared to like 10% or 40%.
Not actually anymore.
I mean, still, it is like infant mortality rates today compared to 500 years ago is a insane difference.
I meant because of abortion, obviously.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Higher, but
that is true.
Well, yeah,
but no, my basic point there is just I think the sort of I think it's hard for people to separate the very real scientific progress from that has occurred over the past 500 years to the social degradation that has also occurred over the same period.
That's a really good point. So I would say the problem is rooted in both a linear view of time and also a linear view of human progress due to certain material developments.
I think also on a more personal level that in a way, it's kind of it's a main difference between Buddhism and Christianity in the sense of, I think improvement in the Christian sense is bringing yourself closer to God by obeying him and kind of praying in, meditating on the mysteries of God. Whereas, in Buddhism, it's more about being able to seek inner perfection. And since that's what liberalism postmodern liberalism has sold to the world, in the sense that you don't become a better person by becoming more like God, i.e. through the process of theosis by being a Christian. You basically just have to become a better you. And that's where the kind of stereotypical kind of white women philosophy of eat, pray, love comes from, of just emphasis, of just sole focus on improving the self, which is not actual real improvement because it's self-isolated and has no emphasis on other people. And ultimately it leads to, I think it's one of the things sold by the sexual revolution and why so many people are okay with abortion, even knowing how evil it is. It's the fact that I'm the most important person. I am now God, rather than I am trying to become like God through being a good Christian. And that's where people, because people are now trying to act like their own miniature gods, killing an unborn child is not real. It doesn't seem as bad to them because they think, well, I'm the most important thing in the universe.
And what you just put up by Robert Fried, progressivism is just bastardized Christianity, and what Rubber Duck also said in the chat, liberalism is a Christian heresy. Those things get right at the heart of the problem. And specifically, it's Gnosticism. Because Gnosticism also had this idea of rejecting the transcendent God in favor of the immanent God, the little light inside of ourselves, that, to really serve God is really to improve yourself, and to do that in the material world. And so we look towards the future as our transcendence, not towards an actual metaphysical separate reality.
Or even our own descendants, because again, that's another explanation of why the birth rates are so low. Is people don't care about their own. People don't even care about their own immediate material. If you can, temporal future through having children, they only care about themselves. But it's also that I think going on Gnosticism is the problem with that, and I think the problem that New Atheism. And also the Enlightenment initially kind of the narrative they tried to spew is that there's this distinct separation between the material and transcendent world, when in reality, they're actually quite intertwined. Earth and heaven are not so far away as I think the Enlightenment wanted to make us think, and so you can't, and because a lot of what the Enlightenment wanted was just a massive rationalization and standardization, it basically saw anything that was messy and any god that was beyond just this simple clockmaker that had good moral ethics. They couldn't understand it and grew to despise it because it doesn't fit within a rationalistic Enlightenment era worldview.
And if I can quickly respond to Adam Albee in the chat. The point of this chat, I don't think, is to prove the existence of the Christian God. I think each of us has probably talked about that separately. And so for the purpose of this chat, I don't think it's important to ask whether you yourself believe in God. But I think the fundamental question is progressivism, the cathedral, whatever you want, fundamentally an attack on the Christian God, whether or not he exists.
It certainly is in part. I mean, the cathedral is more than that, but that's a very fundamental part of it. Because it is a competing religion, right? So it must attack Christianity and any other religion that happens to compete with it.
Yeah, but I don't think the cathedral attacks Christianity as just one of many enemies. I think we have to understand that the attack on God and Christianity is kind of the central thrust of the cathedral.
Because
of course.
Del Noce, who I referenced in my last video, a 1980s Italian philosopher, very much made the point that the sexual revolution is directly tied to Marxism, directly tied to modernism, directly tied to the Gnostics, and all of these were different attacks on Christianity in different ways. Wilhelm Reich, some people in the chat might know his name, but Wilhelm Reich was, a psychopsychiatrist, like the second generation after Freud. And Wilhelm Reich was one of the first to really talk about the theory of repression. And basically his thing was, well, really all the bad stuff that happens in the world is caused by people who are sexually repressed repressed because of religion. And of course, he was a complete degenerate himself. Like, he'd give massages to his patients after stripping them naked, stuff like that. But it was very clear from his writings what the idea was. Introduce sexual libertinism into the populace as a way of fighting Christianity and as a way of destroying the family. The two biggest kind of moral centers of authority in our culture.
Mm-hmm. And it's not merely attacking Christianity either. It's also actively seeking to replace it with its new scientism ethics, or whatever you want to call it. I think that's philosophically pretty much the weakest point in the cathedral, in terms of trying to place a narrative, or trying to convince people out of that narrative. From my perspective, I haven't been able to figure out any way in which you can really justify any absolute or objective moral claims from the atheistic perspective, even though people try very hard to do so. If you really drill into it, and it's not even particularly difficult to do it, use the Socratic method.
It's a fake kind of scorched earth in which it's the same thing of what they do with morality. It's the same thing they do with the historical existence of Christ, in the sense that because like with specifically objective morality, it's Distributus came up with the idea of the Hitchens two-step, right? Where this thing that new atheists will constantly do, which is, and the thing is, it's true of most people in modernity as well, in the sense that, if pressed to say, is good and evil more as kind of subjective a point of view, I think most people, like, when you put it gently like that, will say yes. But then the second you say, does that mean that murder or what Hitler did is okay? They will say no. People inherently don't actually. People will say they believe in moral subjectivism because they think it sounds nice, and it's a way they are. It's a way they can justify having degenerate lifestyles, because 95% of the time when people say they don't like Christian moralities, they're talking about sex. Mm-hmm. But and the few people in history that have actually understood, where moral subjectivism takes you, are people like Nietzsche and Sartre, and people that went kind of insane, understood how bad it is to live in a world with moral subjectivism. And so it's an interesting way that modernity has kind of used moral subjectivism to kind of enforce its own objective version of morality, wherein it's malleable and it changes, but it has its own trajectory. But you're still not allowed to say things are fundamentally right or wrong, because they don't believe right or wrong really exist outside of their own ideology.
It goes beyond that. And again, I hate to bring them up, since I feel like, I'm talking about a book that probably not many others have read here. But Del Noce talks about the fact, he calls it the new totalitarianism. And he says that the whole goal of the modern project now is that questions about faith, it's an attack on the religious impulse. So you can't even ask questions about faith. The idea is, and you guys have probably seen it on Twitter, in social media, in the real world, where if you ask questions like, well, why should we believe the mainstream media on this? What's so bad about X? What's so bad about Y? They don't question your logic. There's no discussion of arguments. The response is, well, you're alt-right.
You're racist. You're
reactionary. You're racist. You're an incel. That's another one.
That's the new one, right? That's them. Interesting how it's always related to sex, right? How weaponized sexuality is, in the sense that people, the most, I said this before, but the most perverted thing you can be in the modern world is a virgin.
Right. Yes, in a sense, the word incel is new, but what is it? What are they really saying? They're saying, well, you only have this opinion, or you're only making this argument because you're sexually repressed. That's the basic thrust of the argument there.
They project this sexual argument just because it's projection, right? This is something academic agent points out. Every leftist attack is projection, and so their personal reasons for their morality or lack thereof are sexual. So they automatically assume that yours are also inherently sexual. That you're justifying your Christianity, or you're adopting it post hoc to justify your lack of sex. When really,
they used to, it's not even new. They used to do, I guess, when the gay marriage debate was the big thing, is they accused basically anybody that was opposed to gay marriage or didn't like homosexuality of being gay themselves.
Right, and I think in some sense they're actually being honest there, in the sense that I think they really do honestly believe that, because this is a common psychological phenomenon, right? I think they really do. They can't conceive of a reality outside of which the sexual domain isn't primary. So I don't think they're even doing it as a sort of sly political attack. I think in most cases they probably really do believe the sexual accusations they're making against you.
Also, Matt, look how ardently they will defend pornography. That you can make all the, and it's why like rational arguments do not work on the vast majority of people, because people tend to act far more on impulses and obviously, you know, when you have your computer machine that basically when you have your computer is now an orgasm machine, people don't want to get rid of it. And so and that's just kind of how violent it's similar to like with weed too, right? Where you criticize people that are really into weed, and you say it's like, I know this was from years ago, but it was a good example of when Steven Crowder was talking with Joe Rogan, and like, you know, like Joe Rogan basically said, you're social conservative, right? And like, what's one issue you'd be okay though with that you don't really care about? And Steven's like, well, I really don't care about weed, but like my only thing is I just wish people would stop talking about it like it's a magic cure-all drug. And Joe Rogan just went nuts and got really mad at him.
Yeah, I remember that. He got extremely angry.
I think that one of the most powerful things I've seen is like just like a drawing of like a fat guy with like a Pornhub t-shirt, like with a bunch of like antidepressants behind him, and like he's like really obese and like addicted to his iPhone. And he's like, no, I don't like religion. It's just a tool to use to control us. And it's why I think I just haven't gotten around to it yet, but I really want to read E. Michael Jones, because he obviously made that great statement that sexual liberation is a tool of political control.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, that's one of the sort of fundamental liberal lies. The idea that the idea that political that political tyranny is more important than internal tyranny. Like for example, I suppose to I suppose to change a C.S. Lewis quote. C.S. Lewis famously said that the tyrant who tyrannizes you out of a sincere conviction to help you is worse than the robber baron. Well, the internal tyranny of sexual desire, or of greed, or of any of those other great sins, is far worse than the external tyranny of the worst tyrant. Because your internal perverse desires will never stop unless you control them, where the tyranny of a tyrant can only last for a limited amount of time.
In a way, this I'm sorry. And in a way, this kind of very much links to people like Hobbes and Confucius, who kind of understood this, and you know, the cultivating the internal self to be a better person is very much in line with. I think they saw that was very much in line with how that affected the rest of society in general, especially Confucius, because this whole kind of philosophy was about was a moral philosophy that extended from both personal development, family, all the way up to the state and its relationship with heaven. And he just saw that people were acting like they do in, you know, an HBO miniseries in which everybody is corrupt and out for themselves, and how kind of morally poisonous that was, not just to the leadership, but also to the individuals, to like, you know, small farming families as well.
Yeah, pretty much most traditions have this concept of the inner war and the outer war, and usually they are linked to one another, with the outer war being more of a result of your inner self. And this is why I say at the beginning, I think the most important part religion can play in our narrative at the moment is in our internal narrative, in really securing our small contingent in the more important inner battle before we can really be effective in the outer.
Because plenty of us still have our own sins that we're you know, we're also affected by morality, even if we understand, or by modernity. If we can understand why it's bad, but it doesn't mean we're not, you know, immune to it. We can do our best, but like, you know, cultivating eternal discipline. And I think that ultimately makes people into better leaders that people will want to follow in a movement that's, you know, going to be presented as an alternative to modernity. Because I think a lot of people are starting to understand that there's problems with modernity, even if it's not enough people right now, as long as like there's this contingent of people that are starting to understand that like the modern world can never make them happy, and liberalism cannot make people happy.
and that's actually goes into, you know, another big part of this that I want to talk about, which is kind of what we go for now. As you pointed out, cultivating inner virtue is a way that, in a sense, we can become attractive as thought leaders, as a movement. And I think this goes back to something that was talked about in the stream last week, which is where are the right-wing heroes? You know, where are the people that we can look up to as examples? And I think the reality is we need to become those. And how do we practice that? Part of it is the cultivation of virtue. But I think one is also to recapture, you know, kind of a big spirit of medieval Catholicism, which is asceticism. You know, we need to actually make sacrifices in our own life. And the thing is, it can't be a Jordan Peterson kind of clean up your room. The fact is, these sacrifices need to be oriented towards something, and that's why religion is important. You know, the idea is these sacrifices need to be given up towards a greater narrative. It needs to be going towards a relationship with the transcendent divine.
Yeah, I would say personally on that, Lent just passed, right? And this was the first Lent I had since I had reconverted to Christianity. And I found that after going through the self-denial for 40 days, you know, I felt I felt like my mind, body, and soul were in the highest alignment and I guess power level, to put it bluntly. That
closest to God, I think.
Yeah, that they've ever really been, and that was really interesting to me because I hadn't actually ever really experienced that before. So I think there really is, in my personal experience, there really is something to this ascetic behavior. It's really important in fostering the internal discipline that will be necessary for you to act out in the outer world, because ultimately you have to bring that discipline outside of you. And this is a really important part too. We're talking a lot about the inner battle here, but ultimately this has to be a social phenomenon. And I think we came up with this in the last stream, but you know, at some point we do need to form, you know, like local operative units or something like that. And I think something I mentioned, if I recall, was maybe the concept of local communal gardening initiatives. And this is a great place to foster this sort of discipline in people and something that's productive and sort of open to the greater society. This is ultimately where this inner battle has to lead. And it can't lead soon.
I'm glad you said something like gardening initiatives and whatnot, because the thing is, like, what is absolute, I think the worst thing that could happen is something that's purely political. Like, the last thing I think we should try and have is a trad political party, because I think this political system is too broken for that to actually do anything. And it's because there's a great example, I think, of, you know, Distributus made another good point, of course, in that certain like colleges were like dropping Shakespeare as a requirement, and he said this is actually, or Shakespeare in the classes as a requirement, and he says this is actually a great opportunity because now actual trads can pick it up. And a great example of this is there's a new publishing it's a like right-wing trad publishing company called Mystery Grove, and they're starting to publish like translations of like of right-wing books. Like I got they have an original 1929 edition of Storm of Steel by Ernst Jünger, and they most recently released Minor of Trouble, which is a British account, or the account of a British volunteer for the nationalists in the Spanish Civil War. And I think things like that are going to be infinitely more useful than just saying, well, than anything TPUSA is going to do.
Yeah, I actually bought that translation from your recommendation on Twitter and just finished reading it.
Storm of Steel?
Storm of Steel, yeah.
I've only read a bit of it first. I've been busy. How was it?
It's the manliest book I've ever read, and it's 100% required reading for everyone listening. It's not even that long, and
it's pretty short.
It's probably the best account of World War I and warfare in general that you could possibly read.
Because isn't it fascinating? Because I've only read part of it so far, but it's like everybody's kind of account of World War I comes partially from All Quiet on the Western Front,
which is fake.
Which isn't actually. Remarque was in the war, but it's only like partially based on his experience. But Junger is just like, no, this is based in awesome. I want to be a warrior, and it's like, what?
So one of the most interesting things of the book, towards the very end, he talks about his experience with being injured. He was injured 16 times, I believe. No, 20. He talked about how he didn't like going out to the hospitals to be treated by women because it sort of introduced this feminine warmth to the war, and it sort of took him out of the hyper masculine feeling of warfare. But he didn't mind the Catholic nurses because they were very cold and objective and not at all feminine about it.
I remember they even mentioned that in All Quiet on the Western Front, both the book and the 1970s movie, that Catholic hospitals are known for being much better. And Junger is proof that it's never too late to convert, because he lived to be 102 and only started receiving the sacraments at age 101. But I also love there's another, like, the man was just looked based as fuck too, in that there's a picture of him and his son at the beach, and it's like, hey, what do we wear at the beach? We're wearing bathrobes and slippers to the beach. What of it?
Yeah, and if I can add, there are other reasons that taking on these ascetical practices is important. As you guys pointed out, little things, even if they don't seem like big sacrifices, once you actually start doing them, you'll see the kind of sacrifices they take. If it's limiting your computer gaming time or your TV watching time, suddenly you will also have much more time to dedicate to constructive projects, whether that's gardening or developing some kind of trade that you can use to help your community. And kind of reignite kind of this traditionalist movement. And the other direction is think about money you spend on comforts. And I'm not saying video games or different kind of comforts are bad, but think about the money you spend on that. One of the other issues that was brought about in the last chat was that the right wing has no money. But part of fighting that is like, do we use our money in the best way we can? If we were to give up some creature comforts, how much money would we be able to direct to, whether it's content creators or other kinds of right-wing projects? Could we actually establish Christian communes simply based on donations? And I'm using commune not in that sense, but that kind of thinking, like, can we create workers' guilds that survive partly based on traditions from people who adopt these ascetical practices? I think it's possible.
Yeah, I think there's something even more sort of base to that aestheticism that's really quite useful. It's just the sort of modern consumer culture that we live in, where everything's about consuming and cooming and eating and all that sort of stuff. Just the most basic aspect of it, that for example, the Friday abstinence of not eating meat. I don't eat tons of meat. I'm sure there's many days in the week where I don't end up eating any meat whatsoever. But just knowing that that's one thing I can't do on Fridays, it is kind of annoying. At least during Lent. But it is just kind of annoying, and it is something to try and take you out of yourself a little bit, to know that there's some basic guidelines that you have to follow. And I think having sort of basic things that you need to stay away from, like that aren't even inherently wrong, like eating meat, is a useful way to sort of detach us from the consumerism.
You're taking things that
regularly
are
approach.
not inherently bad, but still self-denying for the purpose of self-betterment.
Mhm.
Yes, yeah.
But not,
I think
not
most
just for the purpose of self-betterment. Again, we don't want to be kind of Jordan
Yeah.
Peterson cleaning your room. It's about transcending yourself, not in the way that the consumers want you to. Not in, oh, I want to transcend myself by, getting as many dopamine rushes as possible. But I'm transcending myself by denying myself for a supernatural transcendence.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
exactly.
Because that's as I pointed out earlier, that's what kind of separates an actual Christian movement or Christian civilizational push from the eat, pray, love BS that entices all these white women.
Yeah, and I think the denial is important because it, the bodily pleasures can easily have a great effect on you, as we know, and so the denial is important not just from some sort of better yourself health perspective, but because it removes this obstacle that's in your way and that's blocking your spiritual growth.
In a way, it's like I'm trying to lose weight, right? And it's like you can feel overeating and doing all this stuff is like. It feels like it's both physically and spiritually weighing you down. It's like you're so obsessed with food, the food's blocking out Christ from your life.
Mm-hmm.
But somebody pointed out, said like transcend your room, and in a way actually do that. It's kind of there's the expression make earth your heaven, or bring heaven to earth. And it's like, don't clean your room. Don't just clean your room, make your room into a sanctuary. Like, I think most of us as Catholics have like our own kind of miniature home shrines or altars where we have our, icons and crucifixes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, parts of this are just finding ways to deny yourself for the sake of, God. Whether it's giving up little creature comforts that aren't bad in themselves, but things that you realize you're too attached to, things that make you a consumer.
Mm-hmm.
And redirecting that time, that money towards productive stuff. And also like how you spend your time, 10 minutes of spiritual reading and 10 minutes of meditative prayer a day can make you a saint.
Yes.
That's just 20 minutes of your day. How many of us do that? How many of us are really that consistent at doing it?
And it's about consistency as well. There's the great, because I think that's the hardest thing is everybody can like do one big workout session and then they're like, I'm going to do this every day, and then they don't. But it is really important to stress how much making things a habit is important, because Aristotle said, we are what we repeatedly do. Excellence is therefore, a habit.
Yeah, that's a really good point too. So like Lent is over now, right? And I can go back to doing gluttonous things if I want, but in my mind, I don't want to do that. To me, it'd be kind of pointless to go through the ritual and then only revert to some previous state for the rest of the year, and only in this one period am I actually doing anything useful, right? I think it's I think these traditions in some sense can serve as a springboard, but it has to be. You want it to be a permanent ascension, right? Anytime you go through some sort of rite, you want it to have a lasting effect on you. And that can sometimes mean just continuing exactly what you were doing before and not ceasing it.
Oh, Keith Woods is saying hi.
Hello.
Anyways, no, what was I going to say? Never mind.
Well, yeah, the reality is give me 300 people who have the discipline to take cold showers and pray for half an hour every day, and you could remake this country. It would just take 300 people with that kind of discipline, that love for Christ, really, because it's not just about discipline for discipline's sake. It's about that kind of level of love for the divine, where you can deny yourself and say, I am nothing. I am willing to take on whatever challenges. Not for self-aggrandizement, but for to aggrandize Christ. Once you do that, like the old saints, the saints of old. G.K. Chesterton had this line: no saint went out there and was like, I'm gonna build Christendom. The saints were like, I'm gonna love Christ, and in doing that, they built Christendom.
Mm-hmm. Christendom was built after Rome by the writing, by, in a lot of ways, Western civilization was built after Rome by priests peering over and transcribing the Bible and historical works over candlelight year after year, day after day. But I'd also say, though, in a way, I think there's also a good idea to make the movement bold and make it kind of radical and interesting to people. In a way, you kind of want to make a movement sexy in the sense of making it attractive and making it so that everybody kind of has their skin in the game outside of your direct enemies. And it's why I think Christianity has traditionalism, I think, can do really well, or has potential in the sense that it's something that unlike, I guess, libertarianism and ANCAP and a lot of this stuff, which is like made by sterile incel angry men. And I don't mean that as an insult, but that's, it's kind of known that that's what attracts libertarianism. But there's an equal place for men and women in traditionalism, and that's how you get actual communities and a new civilization forming, by families forming.
I'm glad you mentioned the fact about it needing to look positive there, or aesthetically pleasing. One of the interesting concepts I'm reading about in this book I mentioned earlier, The Fourth Turning, is the cycle of generations from prophet, nomad, hero to artist. And in the current paradigm, the Zoomer generation fits into the artist generation, and I think you can see a definite shift in aesthetics occurring within the type of things, the music and the memes or the art that generation is producing. And I think one of the most important things that this new young generation can be doing as part of the movement is generating something that's aesthetically positive and fresh and interesting to people, because no one's interested in something that's boring. If you're thinking of Christianity and you're thinking of these, elderly boomers or something, that's just not interesting to people. It has to be exciting.
Mm-hmm.
And that's an aesthetic phenomenon.
In a way, like, if you look at what's, in a way, you can almost look at it like, take the Warhammer universe, right? But hear me out on this, in the sense that what's kind of fascinating about this is there are people that absolutely or don't like Christianity at all, or kind of hate Christianity.
They love Warhammer.
They love everything about, and in a way, it's what's interesting about it is that, like, Warhammer gets away with being the epitome, being the Platonic form of like totalitarianism, religious zealotry, and xenophobia, but like nobody's upset with it. Yet if the Imperium of Man, or if the world it was in was just toned down a few notches, then it would become unacceptable to modernity. It's only because it is so right-wing that people can tolerate it, because it's kind of comical.
Yeah, Warhammer 40K is probably the best positive fantasy aesthetic we have right now.
No, in a way, like I've heard it was described as, it's kind of what the Imperium is, kind of what your average 18th century Anglican vicar would tell his parishioners that Catholicism was like. But but that makes Catholicism look based, and which it is. And isn't it fascinating? Like, you show a gold encased altar to the emperor, and like there are people that will be like, oh, this is great, this is awesome, hail the the emperor protects. The second you then show, hey, here's a Christian Catholic altar, they'll be like, ew. And that kind of shows like how much of a barrier to Christianity modernity sets up by just by endlessly lying about Christianity in the media, because that's how Christianity is almost always universally portrayed in modern media, as being evil and backwards, like The Handmaid's Tale, right? The idea that America is going to turn into a theocracy in which women are basically cattle, which was never the case in Christianity.
Have you, by any chance, seen that movie Hell's Reach?
No, what is it?
It's a Warhammer 40K fan film. Morgoth did a review on it a few months ago, and it's on YouTube by this guy called Richard Boylan. I'll put it in the live chat. But it's a really positive piece of media, that really jives with our perspective, and I would love to see more things like that happen.
Well, yeah, like going on, like one of the stories I found most interesting is there's the story of like the Demunculaba, because there's a channel called Luton that does all these Warhammer lore videos, and he basically said like this is basically the most effed up thing in the Warhammer universe, and it's basically like these people like they witness like what a bunch of Imperial prisoners are subject to when captured by the forces of chaos, and it's like I don't want to actually say what they're subjected to even here because it's actually really, really disturbing, but just rest assured it's bad. But even then, it's like they show like, oh, they've still themselves built a crude statue to the emperor. Even in this literal hell on hell, they still have their faith in the emperor. And it's like they say, you know, the line of Warhammer is in the grim darkness of the far future, there's only war, but there's also that secondary truth of the emperor protects. And that's kind of in line, you know, with Catholicism, right? It's the world is horribly dark and grim, but there is that shiny beacon of light.
And it's interesting how people, even who are, like you said before, anti-Christian, recognize the inherent awesomeness in this fantasy world, despite how we know everything is miserable and terrible, and you know, the destruction of an entire planet could be commonplace. At the same time, there's something inspiring and positive about it, just in the sheer devotion of these people. People have this inherent instinct to do that highly positively, but in the real world, it's been completely beaten out of them by this image.
They can only like aesthetics when it's not when it doesn't have any real weight to it, in the sense that Christianity actually requires you to believe in something that's not popular, as opposed to something like you can just at the end of the day still say, oh well, you know, as cool as it is that they have this devotion to the emperor. But like at the end of the day, it's not real. I'm not compelled to listen to any of it, as opposed to Christianity, which, you know, that's one of the things is that, and again, it goes part and parcel with why the sexual revolution has destroyed much of Christianity, in the sense that in the West, in that, you know, Christianity requires you to give up pornography and free sex, and people do not want to do that. People do. It's Peter Hitchens' argument as his biggest problem with atheism is more the fact that these people don't want there to be a God because they don't want, it's not because they don't believe in him. It's they hate God in large part because they hate the idea of any sort of structure or justice in the universe. They don't want they don't want their actions to be judged. They don't want they don't want their actions to have consequences. They want to be able to do whatever they want with no repercussions.
Well, it's funny. It's funny because even believing that sort of inherently shows that they know what they're doing is wrong, right? Why would you believe that if you thought that what you were doing is fine?
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't even think they do. I think that's kind of more the deeper underlying reasons behind it. I think it's more just people are, because there's two different types of people we're talking. There's the people that are active, like there's the NPCs, and then the actual players. There's the people that are just the average, you know, kind of pleb masses that generally just go along with whatever the technocracy and the media go with. So they'll be like that. That's where you get the vast majority of the people that say I'm spiritual but not religious. They want they want to go to heaven, but they don't want to actually have to do anything to get there. Whereas then you have the people that are actual hardline atheists, and I think theirs just comes from a deep-seated hatred of God that they claim to not actually believe in. It's in his.
I think. Sorry, didn't mean to cut you off, but I think a fundamental point here is that the way our world is set up is that, you know, just the metaphysics of our universe is that virtue corresponds with sacrifice. Like, I'm sorry, there's no way around it. If you want to be virtuous, if you want to be a good person, if you want to be moral, it requires sacrifice. Like, personal perfection requires sacrifice. And I think that's very hard. That's very hard for the left to understand. And that's why they're always dedicated to utopian project building.
I thought you were also going to say,
because they're looking for a future wherein you can be moral, you can be a good person, and you don't actually have to, you know, feel a little bit of pain or struggle or sacrifice to do it.
They want
And
to.
that's what,
Sorry, go ahead.
and that's why they're attracted to if you want to call them works of art, but stories I think like Harry Potter or something. Whatever your opinion of Harry Potter, there are some genuinely good storytelling there. But why is Harry Potter such a fixation for them? I think it's a kind of way for them to see someone else's sacrifice and be like, well, it's good that there are people like that in the world. And we're working for a world where the defeat of evil, where the defeat of Voldemort leads to a world
for the right.
What? Sorry,
I said Voldemort is basically just a straw man of the right, where he doesn't actually have reasons for why he does what he does. He's just racist and crazy and evil.
Mm-hmm. But the whole point is, once you defeat Voldemort, then we'll be able to be happy without actually having to sacrifice.
What I was going to say is on Harry Potter. Actually, I think it goes even further, because I thought about this. Is that the way the wizards and witches in Harry Potter have magic, at least as far as it was explained in the books, is it's neither something like I guess like what I'm watching right now, the anime Little Witch Academia, where you have to basically earn it. And or it's something that's passed down genetically through generations. It's basically like whether or not you can have magical parents or non-magical parents, and you can just be a great wizard just because, unless you're comic relief. And it's like that's kind of how they see that, social justice warriors see themselves, or the Antifa crowd, in that they don't want to they want to be these special people that are important and, heroes, but they don't actually want to do anything to earn it. It's the same thing with the superhero genre, right? In that, how many of these superheroes have actually earned what they do? It's just they just have magical powers because of circumstance, and now they're essentially demigod Ubermensch that exist to serve the neoliberal order.
When they're also not even particularly good people.
No, Superman murdered hundreds of thousands of people.
Right,
in the Man of Steel movie, he blows up half of Metropolis. But
or just the star character in Marvel, Tony Stark. He doesn't deserve what he's doing, not just in a neutral way, but he's sort of actively a distasteful person, right?
You also just think about this, is that if they could get away with it, because a friend of mine, or somebody on Twitter, made a great point, and he basically talk about how whenever the left talks about gun control, and they're like, "You really think your AR-15 can stand up to the U.S. military?" That they have this kind of this fetishized fantasy, right, where they can use these kind of effeminate men can basically order the U.S. Army to start shooting at armed American Southerners. And it's the same thing, I think, in the superhero genre, in which they because if they could get away with it, which they probably will at some point, if they have just an actual right wing, just not even like a facsimile for it, but just an actual right wing villain or movement, they'll want to have these superheroes basically just use as tools to show that we will not hesitate to execute anybody that disagrees with us, and we will use these supermen to do it because we're too weak to do it ourselves. Because that's the kind of thing you always notice with a lot of these Antifa and left-wing people, right? Is that they have that look about them, the kind of high estrogen soy boy.
Mm-hmm. I mean, in the Age of Ultron movie, even the superheroes themselves are trying to kind of check out, and the whole plot revolves around just trying to have these robots enforce the order, to the point where human beings don't even have to try, right? If you're even remotely against the neoliberal order, some robot is just going to come and assassinate you, basically. I think that's even a plot as well in one of the Captain America movies. I think The Winter Soldier, where they have the giant aircraft carriers, and they're going to shoot 100 million people at once, and it's the bad guys trying to do that, right? But at the same time, that's kind of the leftist wet dream. They would love to just have this super weapon to just eliminate all resistance all at one time.
Isn't it fascinating though that your young kind of Tumblr leftist was all in love with Heath Ledger as the Joker in 2008, but now it's completely the opposite with the 2009 2019 Joker, in the sense that the Nolan Batman movies kind of represented there's a good argument that it's a very kind of conservative movie series of he's there to enforce not just a neoliberal order, but just kind of a basic standards of morality against these psychopaths. Whereas now people are like, well, the order that they're trying to uphold is evil to a lot of people.
The reference to those movies is interesting. I think Closington referenced them in one of his videos recently. How Ra's al Ghul and Bane are basically the good guys in those movies.
Ra's al Ghul is a complete reactionary, right? He's basically the one that's like, Gotham is too degenerate to deserve to exist. It'd be better if we just wiped it clean, because we know if even you can save all the people you want, Batman, but it's not going to fix Gotham ultimately.
And based on the second movie, he's basically right. I mean, the Dark Knight is basically the low point.
There's the argument then to be made that the biggest problem with Bruce Wayne is that he could have done so much better. He could do so much. Oh, spoilers! Bruce Wayne is Batman, but he could do so much better as the billionaire than going out and punching people dressed like a bat at night. Like he could be much more of a him as the philanthropic billionaire like his parents were is probably much better for Gotham than being, the power fantasy.
Right, but does that actually change something? I mean, I don't want to give away too much about where I live, but I live in a world I live in a city where a lot of the city property is owned by billionaires, and it has a lot of the similar problems of Gotham. So if Bruce Wayne were to just start buying up properties and essentially gentrifying Gotham, would that fix the dominant narrative? Or is there something fundamentally different about rejecting the conventional way and fixing Gotham by dressing up as a bat and punching people?
Mm-hmm. But then of course his biggest thing is that Batman doesn't have the balls to do what's ultimately necessary, which is, it would be better for Gotham if he had just killed the Joker, if he just killed these people. But I don't know. I'm sorry. I don't like the superhero genre, but there is certainly interest in it. But what's fascinating though is that we talk about cultivating these. We need modern heroes on the right, because it feels like we've kind of the world is. It's almost like it's progressed past like the era of like great men or people of history makers like Napoleon, Charlemagne, and Caesar, wherein like. Trump is not any of these people, and none of the leaders of the modern world are even like a fraction of any of these people, good or bad. But like, and it makes it seem like it's why, despite it being the kind of epitome of the progressive utopia, why I like Star Trek a lot. The most unrealistic aspect of Star Trek that I found is that if this was a neoliberal progressive utopia, there's no possible way that people like Picard, Riker, and Kirk could exist, because like Picard is like, especially, he's this romantic, French gentleman that just loves like old literature and stuff. He's like, like his like ideal is like he wants to live in like 1940s crime film noir, which obviously for that time that's centuries old. But like, there's no possible way that somebody like that could emerge in that universe.
Yeah, I think what part of the problem with I guess the modern point of view in general is they have this idea, I guess, that they can sort of pick and choose which parts of high culture in particular they want, and they don't really understand the holistic sense in which Western civilization exists. That's why
almost all the fantasy genre sucks, because it's like, especially it's like I really don't like it much in anime either, because it's just the fact that it's like, well, we have this nice aesthetic, but it's like everybody basically acts like they would in modernity in this world. It's why I like science fiction a lot more, because that actually explains real ideas.
Yeah, that's really my biggest problem with lots of historical fiction, but fantasy in particular, where you have what should be extremely hierarchical societies, and often are portrayed as extremely hierarchical societies, but then every single main character is a 21st century progressive.
And everything ends with it becoming the United States of America.
Yeah, I played the game recently, several months ago, that I did really enjoy a lot of aspects to it, but the newest Fire Emblem game, Three Houses, and it is a solid game in terms of mechanics and stuff and aesthetics and everything, but it's an extremely hierarchical society. All the main characters, most of the main characters are supposed to be the children of the nobility, and you can see from the background sort of lore that it is supposed to be a mostly traditional a traditional feudal society. But then every single character, with like maybe one or two exceptions, is a 21st century liberal. They all think all this formality and stuff, which is just a baseline for their entire culture, is stupid. That they all are basically feminists and Democrats, and it's a massive disconnect, and there's no good explanation why why obviously this culture is very traditional that they're supposedly living in, but why this has completely changed immediately. And there isn't a good explanation, because there can't be one. At least if this was like some sort of band of rebels or something, there might be some explanation for it. But these are literally the future leaders, and it's just an obvious complete disconnect from how the society is said to be run in the background and how it actually is being run.
It's fascinating. There's two good examples I'm going to bring up of fantasy series that don't do this, and they do it much smarter. One is Avatar: The Last Airbender, in which the Fire Nation, that's kind of the big bad authoritarian country that's invading. At the end of it, they don't make it into the United States of the Fire Nation. They don't end the monarchy. They do it in Legend of Korra, because that's the example of how you don't make the series. But the same thing is in the game Valkyria Chronicles 4, in which it's a turn-based tactical shooter. It's set in an alternate World War II, in which like the big Nazi bad guys are like a combination of like Nazi Germany and Imperial Russia. And at the end of the game, like, it basically rejects the kind of neocon idea that anybody that doesn't agree with us has to be exterminated. And they basically have the option to, if you're going to play it, don't just mute the volume for the next 5 seconds, where they're like, we have the option to basically sacrifice ourselves and nuke the capital of the empire. But they basically decide no, because just killing all these more innocent people is just not worth it, just because we hate authoritarianism. And that's kind of the biggest thing that I'm afraid. It's something that I pointed out, I think, in my Why I'm a Monarchist video, right? Is that the thing that's kind of terrifying is the kind of militant nature of liberal democracy, wherein like they'll point out like people like Sargon and whatnot will like talk about like, well, democracy and liberalism is the best because it just, it's the issue. It's, it wins because it's like been debated and has the best ideas, when that's never actually been the case. Liberalism won over modern liberal democracy won over the world by basically killing and bombing every country that didn't agree with it in submission. These ideas did not transfer peacefully. Now you can say the same thing with like monarchy, but at least monarchy is honest about, feudal monarchs in Europe were warriors. They were pretty much warriors up until the end of the Middle Age, and they didn't lie.
The whole narrative that ideas ideas take power because they went out in some sort of free marketplace for ideas is just blatantly untrue. It's a stupid Enlightenment. It's a stupid Enlightenment mythology that was invented.
Argue that it should become a republic. We had an open forum live stream debate with the king, and just people voted. It says, we just don't like democracy. We don't like monarchy anymore. And it was just that's how it worked.
Yeah,
you see this in fiction as well. Like if you consider the Star Wars prequels. What happens is some star systems decide they don't want to be in the Republic anymore. So what does the liberal democracy do? It starts an intergalactic war to beat them into submission.
Even though they were kind of justified in everything. What's fascinating is because they're very much a representation of they're both kind of commercial interests, but they're also very much like the Confederacy. from the American Civil War, in the sense that you look at their flag. Their flag is basically the Bonnie blue flag, which is a blue background with a white star. This is a blue background, same shade of blue, with like kind of a white symbol in the middle as well.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, it shows like kind of a lot of these traditions they show in fiction are very fragile, in the sense that like, oh, you know, this big bad evil empire, we've beaten them now. It's like, well, we're just going to be a liberal democracy now, but like there was never an enlightenment in your universe.
Yeah, that I think we really touched on here why a lot of these modern pieces of media just don't make any sense.
I will give it to this, like I only watched the first few seasons of Game of Thrones, but like from what I heard of how it ended is like they at least didn't go that far, and apparently in the end they just said, you know, to stop the fighting in Westeros and stopping all this regicide, we're going to make it an elective monarchy, more like the Holy Roman Empire, in which like all of the seven kings will just agree on who the next king is, which at least that's a little more reasonable. But they still apparently have Arya Stark just go off and sail to discover America.
Yeah, that's a bit different from the books, of course, because they haven't ended yet. But that's a good example of a piece of media where the characters aren't all just modern liberal progressives, and I think that's one of the reasons it's so compelling. And it's really interesting how modern people are so attracted to this style of filmmaking that is basically completely at odds with everything they really believe, and yet it's immensely popular.
The problem, though, with Game of Thrones kind of has the opposite problem, in which it's too cynical and dark, and that the actual Middle Ages did have a lot of these horrible asshole people, but it also had Saint Francis of Assisi and Saint Catherine of Siena and plenty of, you know, genuinely good people.
I think that might be a factor of the Gen X influence on the show.
Yeah, but like it's also just liberalism, where you can't portray it as like, you can't portray any religion, anybody that's religious or especially affiliated with a facsimile for the church in media. They either have to be psychotic or completely corrupt, and it comes from just the narrative that's the Enlightenment gave us about the Middle Ages, because they had to fill the gap between what on earth happened in civilization between, you know, our beautiful deified Greco-Roman civilization and us new, you know, philosophs now. Well, they basically had to say, well, the Catholic Church was just psychotically evil and basically lied to everybody for 1,000 years.
So outside of Warhammer 40K, is there anything in modern Western media that actually portrays religion positively?
Depends on where it's coming from. I mean, not particularly. I mean, even Warhammer doesn't really portray it good, because it's super zealous, and it's also, you know, whilst everybody in the Imperium believes in the Emperor as a god, but the reality is, of course, he was an atheist that basically went on a crusade to try and get rid of religion.
Yeah, that's actually a good point. I suppose I had forgotten that part of the lore. It is kind of ironic how that worked out. But yeah, I can't particularly think of anything either. I would say a lot of things, and this is why they're so weird, like the Marvel movies, for example, are completely a-religious, which is actually strange, because the real world isn't like that. People are religious beings and they have these metaphysical beliefs, but in film these days, especially these large, expansive universes, it's kind of completely missing. And it feels very dead because of that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, that I think that's just pretty simply profit seeking on their part. They don't want to scare off all the, you know, diverse audiences that could be offended by whatever form of spirituality they try to put into it.
Some magic made up bullshit, like I guess in like now to be again, I have not seen I haven't seen any of the Marvel movies since the first Avengers, but like I know the basic premise of a lot of them. It's like Doctor Strange is just like, oh, Easter mythicism is good, or like, you know, Black Panther is here's this magical we was Kang's, you know, civilization, but and I just can't stand these universes and giants. Like, I prefer just self-contained stories that aren't that long. And I guess that's why I can't really get into any shonen anime anymore, just because I can't go through all those episodes. Give me something short.
Even the new Star Wars movies, which are one of the few things to actually have religion in any sense in them, portray it negatively, right? Like especially in the Last Jedi, the whole point of the movie is basically an attack on the Force or transcendence itself.
There's so much potential there to make the idea, like, I would have, if I was in charge of making that, I would have kept characters like Rey and Kylo Ren, but I would have just had the whole idea of both the struggle between the dark and the light side of the Force, that being the enemy. Same thing with like the fact that the war between the rebels and the Empire just will not end, and that some new thing has to come in and fix it. That would have been genuinely interesting. But no, they have to make Star Wars porn that people can masturbate over for nostalgia purposes. Which is ironic because my favorite of the new ones is Rogue One, and that's basically most of what it is. But it's like, at least the thing is, like, there's nothing wrong with enjoying, like, oh, here's a really cool space battle, and look, it's Darth Vader killing people. Like, that's still interesting. But
yeah, they at least didn't bastardize the rest of the series at all in that one. It did at least feel authentic. I also, this is just a weird preference of mine, but I really love movies and stories that end with all the main characters dying. That's just one of my favorite things.
I actually really enjoy the World War II movies that end that way, and a lot of them do. A lot of the classic ones. I'm not sure why it's so interesting. There's just something about the characters having this epic, heroic death, doing something really important. That's interesting.
My favorite World War II movie is Downfall, the one about Hitler, because that one, first off, I think is a movie that Germany needed to see. Unfortunately, they didn't follow up with it in the sense of that movie actually has a quite, despite being possibly one of the darkest subject matters possible, Hitler and the Nazis killing themselves at the end of World War II, which is obviously very dark period or dark subject matter. There's still, like, the ending is actually incredibly light because, like, some of the characters you follow, like the main character is like one of Hitler's secretaries, and like there's also this kind of unnamed young blonde German boy, and they both end up escaping the Red Army, and they're just kind of let go, and like it ends in the morning in this kind of somber but kind of hopeful music, and it shows like some of these Germans like starting to rebuild, and it shows like there is something beyond just this. There is something beyond Nazism in World War II. And you can and that came out in 2005. And that movie is, I think it's one of my favorite movies. But in 2010, they made a movie called A Woman in Berlin, and it's basically about, it's like the complete opposite, and it's almost like kind of cuckold porn of, it's a story of like how all these German women got raped by the Red Army, and they like portray it like, look at the relationships they're having with the Red Army. It's like celebrating them like winning the war and like singing the Soviet anthem, and it's like just disturbing because like no. I
think the Dune movie that's supposed to come out this year will be pretty interesting in terms of the religious themes, because that's obviously a movie about a sort of prophet or messiah, God King, I suppose, and there are some Christian elements or pseudo-Christian elements to the reality of the movie. Yeah, so that will be an interesting, I guess, case study in how something that is inherently religious. I mean, there's no getting around the religious aspect of Dune. It'll be really interesting to see exactly how they handle that. I expect we might be surprised in this case.
I mean, I've never read Dune, which is going to make everybody upset, but I need to. Everybody says it's good, and I like science fiction and space stuff, but I don't know. I just don't really trust Hollywood to do something good with something like that. But and what's interesting though is among a lot of the people, the psyche of the people on the right is we despise movies. It's like the perfect example of this is what happened with the movies Captain Marvel and Alita Battle Angel, which were both quite similar. They're both basically superhero movies, but like one the right kind of absolutely despised, and the other, like, there was the whole Alita challenge, right? And this was like started by like normie conservatives of like, watch this instead. And it's like, it's a really good movie. I liked it a lot, but it's like, it's not really like, the high art or something that's all that different. It's still just another fun, kind of interesting superhero action movie, but it's just people, and it's made by Fox. So it's not like a small little independent film. It's just interesting the way people will respond to it. And it's made me interested of like, especially with the pandemic going on right now, how quickly people have I think one of the things that's going to come out of this is the fact that I think the conservative liberalism that we know of, that epitomed by TPUSA and normie cons, I think it's probably it's dead. And I think this virus was the killing blow, because basically this said that, like, no, people don't really care about economic issues anymore, and they're fine with authoritarianism in these cases, right? Because, like, Trump basically did partially what Andrew Yang made his whole platform on, and I haven't seen any major conservatives be against it.
Yeah.
Trump is the new Reagan for normie conservatives, in the sense that they just like the personality and what they think he represents. Because Reagan, I think people say, like, didn't actually really do anything productive as president, but just people liked his personality so much. And so basically, if Trump now says, we're now going to just give people free money, like, conservatives are like, yeah, it's fine.
Yeah, this is
Even
actually
though-
something David
Well,
Hines talks about in his article. Trump is one of these, I forget the exact word for it, but it's Obama was the same thing, where you can basically project whatever you want onto them. And I'm not sure how purposeful Trump
They're
is.
fair weather. It's like fair weather. Principles have turned into fair weather principles, as opposed to being much more loyal to the actual person in charge.
I think I guess maybe to get back to the topic somewhat too, that's actually really useful for us, because if we can present actual real principles that people recognize as true, or at least that we truly believe in them, that can be really attractive to people in terms of giving something for them to actually believe in, as opposed to these passing fads of TPUSA or Trump or whatever, right? Something like Christianity can present something that's more eternal and real.
Mm-hmm. I mean,
I think what's sort of important about, especially Catholicism in particular, is really trying to present an authentic and consistent alternative. Not something like normie-servatism, which is which even on its better ends is like tax cuts and no abortion. But what Christianity really needs to show is an actual alternative to the modern lifestyle.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason Christianity can do that, and why specifically I think Christianity, rather than just religion in general, or like traditionalism in general, is because it's a relationship with a person. It's a relationship with the person of Jesus Christ. It's not a malleable ideology. It's not just a set of beliefs you have to ascribe to, like conservatism, but it's a relationship with an actual person. And you can go lukewarm on traditionalism itself, but you can't go lukewarm in a relationship. That's that's fundamentally what I think we have to base, neo-reactionary, NRX, traditionalism, whatever you want to call us. That's what it has to be based on. Because if you're not doing this for love of Christ, then
you're not doing it for the right reasons, then will ultimately become corrupted.
Right.
I also think what's also useful about Catholicism in particular is that it's like a chain of tradition from Christ till now. It's apostolic succession, that the apostles, that the hands of the apostles touched the first bishops, going all the way down to today. That's a direct line of succession for 2,000 years. It's an actual real living tradition that has existed for this entire 2,000 years civilization. So it's not something nearly as malleable like any of the Protestant denominations, or like any of the petty politics like conservatism, where they can just be reimagined. It's an actual living tradition that has existed for this entire period. Like, for example, I've been trying to learn a lot of the basic prayers in Latin. And when I pray Our Father in Latin, I'm praying it more or less in the same way that people have been praying it for about 2,000 years.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know when the first Latin-speaking Christians were, but it would have been relatively early on. Of course, the first would have been Greek and Hebrew and Aramaic and stuff. But still, the principle that people have been praying those exact words for almost 2,000 years. It's an actual sort of chain of tradition binding you back, and it's not just these sort of petty politics that can be reimagined every generation.
And it's not like the way again, I always bring up the distributist because he has these good points, but I like to expand upon them. It's like he was watching one of the debates, one of the TPUSA question and answers, and like he pointed out, right, how Charlie Kirk calls like, why are you a Christian or something? He's like, I think the Bible is the best book ever written. And he's like, it's like he points out, like conservatives like this will talk about it like Christianity isn't just the absolute truth. It's just the best, right? We have the best Bibles, we have the best religion. It's in a way that like it can be lost, right? In that. It's something that can lose a competition, and moreover, I think like for a lot of conservatives, they think of Christianity as more of a tool that supports their own views of individual liberty, as opposed to that being the absolute truth. Or rather, the classical liberal position was that freedom is the inherent good, right, and that things are good because they lead to human freedom, as opposed to things that is that there's certain aspects of wanting more freedom that are good, but it's not freedom itself that is ultimately good.
Now that you mentioned that, referring to the Bible that way is quite debasing. To refer to it just as a really well-written book, right?
Yeah, it's like it's a product.
Right. Yeah, that's gross.
Well, you gotta make sure that the line goes up. You make sure stonks go up.
One of the really cool things about Christianity as well is the inspiring figure of Christ, because it's easy to overlook the personhood of Christ. The fact that he was also a man is really important, because the inspiring thing there is that while Christ did on occasion use supernatural powers for healing and stuff, most of what miracles. Christ actually does is miracles. Sorry.
Don't use modernist language, because that's how like atheists will describe it.
Most of what Christ actually does, a person can do, right? So when he's not doing miracles, he's a man, and you can do that too. You can actually emulate his behavior. If you were perfect somehow, which obviously no one is, but you could actually do
outside of the Blessed Virgin,
right? You could do basically every individual action he does, which isn't actually possible in a lot of religions, where all of the figures are gods and demigods and simply not normal men at all.
Or you don't even want to be like the gods in Greek mythology.
Yeah, you certainly don't. They don't present an ideal. Christ presents an actual achievable ideal for people.
I think even the Greeks, because this is in one of the letters of Paul, right? When he's in Athens and he sees the memorial or the monument to an unknown god. It's like even the Greeks had some concept of a higher god, but yeah, Zeus the Coomer, like they all act like they should be on a reality TV show on MTV.
They just act like people. They act like people with magic powers, right? They're really
Yeah, no, I mean the Christian the Christian concept of God and the pagan concept of God are, I mean, these are really the same word to describe two completely different things. And then it's not just that the conduct of Zeus the Coomer is worse than like the conduct of Jesus. It's that they essentially just view gods as like superhumans, and they're just like really cool and they have a lot of power. That's not what we believe God is. What we believe God is the source of all existence. He is. He's not just really powerful. He is.
No, you can just end it. He is the great I am. But interestingly enough, that I just noticed, right, is that the humans in Greek mythology seem to be more superhuman and godlike than the gods, who are portrayed as more human. Whereas in the Bible and the Old Testament, humans are portrayed more as human and God is more as God. As in, like, Theseus, Achilles, and Heracles are very, they have like these kind of tragic giant flaws that they do, but they're still like essentially gods themselves, demigods. Whereas in the Old Testament, you actually have far more flawed in characters like King Solomon, Moses, David, and Saul.
I think the point there about God is, and he's not like just some dude in the clouds, is a really important point too, because this is a misconception a lot of people have that I think gets in the way of understanding Christianity at all. God is far too personified in how modern people think of him. I mean, obviously you have the figure of Jesus for that point. Yeah. But God himself it's difficult to talk about because all we have are these terms of language that refer to him personally, but he's not a person. He's not he's not a super person either.
God is the personhood of Christ is what we should refer to when we think of God as a man. But the white man with the beard that is painted by the Renaissance, that's just how they could best describe God the Father as this kind of wise old creator. And it's like, yeah, God. Guru Savage said, God is not super Zeus, and and that's the thing is like the other thing that I've noticed, especially with Catholicism, is that there needs to be, I think so much of a problem is that of language, and also the idea of things needing to be what they are and not going more or less. Like it's a big problem hurdle that Protestants have with Mary, in that not being able of thinking that there's only just humanity and God, as opposed to there's our angels, archangels, thrones, dominions. It's like Mary is what she is. She is the Theotokos. She is the mother of God. Is she God? No. Is she just a woman? No. She is the mother of God, and that's what she is. No more, no less. Now it is a heck of a lot, but I think downplaying it is a huge trap of why you like, if people had an understanding or relationship with Mary as well, you would not have anybody trying to think of God as mother. Because like a very tragic figure in modern Catholicism was Audrey Assad, the singer, and her music, I think, for Christian music, is probably some of the best. And she was like a good Catholic convert, and just in the past few years, she's borderline basically completely abandoned all of it. And she's divorced her husband and is like all fine with gay pride now, and she just constantly refers to God as our mother too. Ugh. And it's like the biggest problem I have with that with people like that is she's a convert, so it's like when I was confirmed, right? Like you have to essentially swear an oath, or you have to say that I agree with and I believe in everything the Catholic Church teaches. And that's basically, she's betrayed that and says, I don't do that anymore. If you do that, you shouldn't call yourself a Catholic. But yeah, it's like, it's the same thing. Bishop Barron made this point, right? Is if there was still enough nuns in churches, if we didn't have the collapse of monastic orders, the idea of women priesthood wouldn't even really be a thing, because it wouldn't be seen as necessary, right? Because you have the male priests and you have the female nuns that are also, that are doing the Catholic education. And same thing is like, you have God the Father, but you also have Mary the Mother, who's obviously not God, but you have that maternal aspect through the Mother of God.
Yeah, that's a really good point there.
I remembered something. There is a somewhat modern example of a fantasy universe that actually kind of treats religion good, and it's the manga anime series Spice and Wolf, which is a fun, low fantasy about this merchant finding this ancient wolf spirit that just wants to be returned home, and it's set basically in 13. It's set in an analogous 13th century Eastern Europe, so the end of paganism in Europe at the time. And the church is more played as neutral. They're not played as evil. And the characters are generally religious. They might not be all zealous, but they will constantly talk to each other, before ending a conversation, they'll be like, God bless, Godspeed and God keep you. But when asked if she's a god, Holo, the main character, she's like, no, I'm Ho the wise wolf, and that's all that I am. And it's like she just is a aspect of nature. And there's a great chapter in one of the manga in which there's I guess in this universe, priests can get married and have kids, and there's a daughter of a priest, and her faith is tested by the existence of Holo, because she thinks, oh no, does this mean paganism is true? But eventually he's like, no, I still believe in the sole God creator, because I know you're not actually a god. And Holo's like, yeah, I'm not. It's definitely worth checking out, because it at least treats it fairly.
Is there an anime of that?
Yes. There's
Is it any good?
Yes.
Okay, I might add that to the roster.
Actually,
of course, you would never see anything like that made by Westerners, right?
No.
Yeah, I actually, in terms of video games or a video game in this instance that treats religion somewhat well. I thought the original Fallout games did it pretty well. It was never really the main focus. But Fallout 4 is awful in this respect, in most respects, but especially in this respect. But New Vegas and the original first two Fallout games, I thought they did religion relatively well, where they both had like these weird, crazy cults that were invented that weren't that interesting, but they also had Christianity and Mormonism.
Oh yeah, Mormonism apparently in Fallout is the religion that survives the most, and like one of its characters in the game is like the most based.
Yeah. And yeah, that there was one DLC in New Vegas that was centered around that Mormon guy. I can't remember his name off the top of my head.
Joshua.
Yeah, Joshua Graham. And yeah, he has a lot of really amazing quotes. My favorite is I survived because the fire burning inside me was stronger than the fire burning outside of me.
That's awesome.
Though that was literal. He was literally being burnt.
Grand Canyon.
Yeah. But no, yeah, he's a really epic character, and that game in general, not just New Vegas, even Fallout 3 to a limited extent. There's a small Catholic church which treats it relatively well. But no, in Fallout 4, I think it's just the same sort of thing I was talking about before, where they're afraid of offending people by having serious religions in them. So they all have to be either these crazy post-apocalyptic cults, or they're
universalists.
Yeah, where they have like a universalist church, not like a Christian universalist, just like literally a church to all gods.
I also noticed this in Fallout 4. Every church that you come across, they don't have any crosses on top of it.
Oh, that's
I never
really
noticed
interesting.
Like they don't have. There's plenty of churches that you find they don't have any crosses anywhere in them. They did in like Fallout New Vegas and 3.
Oh yeah, I never noticed that, but yeah, that's probably true.
Mhm.
But no, yeah, I think it's just that same. I don't even think it's like a direct hatred of Christianity. I think it's just a sort of corporate fear of offending anyone.
Fear indifference.
Yeah. But yes, it's also sort of from a different aspect too. A thing that I noticed is they were terrified of having any sort of prostitution in Fallout 4, which was a staple of all the previous games.
Your character is just is a bisexual playboy that can have sex with anybody, but I guess that was just more they wanted the character to have fun. It's not really that big of a thing for me. I kind of liked Fallout 4 just in the sense that exploration and shooting is fun. As opposed to like Fallout 4. I mean Fallout New Vegas, which shooting is really bad. That's why I'm just waiting for them. I don't give a crap about the Final Fantasy remake because I hate JRPGs. But like I would love like a Fallout New Vegas remake and like the Fallout 4 engine. Well, maybe not the Fallout 4 engine because of the bugs, but
yeah. So is there anything else anyone wants to talk about?
We pretty much ran the gamut here, I think.
Talk about for about 2 hours.
Yeah, it's been about 2 hours, so I think it's a good place to end. Does anyone have anything they want to end on? Any closing statements? Or
I had one last thing I wanted to think of. I had thought up is that something else in modern media that just the last thought I think is interesting is that it is like the popularity of shows like Hitman in the High Castle and like the new Wolfenstein games. Of how like it's not enough for them to like just say, because it's like you can't just have like World War II era let's kill the Nazis anymore, because I think they even think that the greatest generation were also a bunch of evil races, which there is truth to it. There's actually they did a poll in 1943, and apparently 90% of Americans responded saying that they would rather lose the war than end segregation. It's kind of depressing, but it's like they have to make it. First off, it's like they like to have the cool alternate history scenarios, but it's like something I noticed in but it's like the new Wolfenstein games. I've seen like playthroughs of it, and it's like Wolfenstein. Wolfenstein is a series in which you fight Mecha Hitler, and then the Nazis are summoning demonic powers. Obviously, you're not really supposed to take it seriously, but it's like the newer ones, like they take it so seriously and make it seem like we're fighting. And it's like I watched the E3 last year. And like the guys that were making the new one that's set in like the 80s, in which like it's set in the Nazi France in the 80s, and like And it's like they still like the way they're talking about it, it's like you can still destroy the Nazi scum. And it's like there's it's just like they have this thought of like they have to keep killing the Nazis, right? They have to keep keeping this in existence because obviously Donald Trump is president, right? That's but it does lead to the scary thing about it, and it's why the Antifa justifies their violence, right? It's this very simple A to B to C, right? Nazis are inhuman monsters, and it's perfectly okay to kill them. Anybody that's right wing is a Nazi, so it's perfectly acceptable to kill everybody that's right wing. But like, Man in the High Castle, I saw the first few episodes of it, and like the bizarre thing is that like they make it look a lot worse than it would be, but it's like the thing that would be most interesting would be an alternate history where the Germans win, but like Hitler dies in the 50s, which he would have anyway. He was not a healthy person because the Nazi regime probably would have just fallen apart. But anyways, like in the Japanese occupied area, they basically got rid of all Bibles and churches. And like one of the characters is at a funeral and like they turned a church into like a Buddhist temple. And I'm like, that would never, ever happen. Not only because no American would ever accept that, but according to a 1940 law on religious reform in Imperial Japan, they basically said Christianity is one of our official religions. But yeah.
Yeah, the one of the largest Christian churches was in Hiroshima, was it not?
No, I think Nagasaki. Much of the Christian population in Japan was nuked out of existence. But on a last note, something that I watched that was also hilarious was what's it called? Designated Survivor. I did a short video review of it. And again, it shows how like everything, how blatant left-wing politics has to be in media, right? And that it's set in like, you know, a terrorist attack wipes out Congress and all of the heads of, and everybody in presidential succession except for like the head of housing and urban development, just some low-level bureaucrat. And so now he's president, has to deal with it. And like at first they're all like, well, it's Islamic terrorists. And then it's like the governor of Michigan basically says, we're gonna start arresting Muslims on the spot because apparently the governor of a state has the power to just order local police around. And apparently I've heard like in the end, guess who actually killed the president? The evil right-wingers, evil Republicans killed Congress.
One of the just to jump on that a little bit, one of the interesting things in The Man in the High Castle is the Japanese, because the show is like set in the 60s or something like that, in a fairly modern time. But the Japanese are still very traditional and pious, and it's really interesting to see them act out their, I guess, traditional behaviors in a highly modern setting with, you know, Concorde jets flying around and stuff, and you have characters still ready to commit ritualistic suicide, and there's still an emperor, and they're just highly ordered and religious. It's kind of interesting to see that play out in a modern setting, because it's not really something you would ever see in anything but alternate history.
Mm-hmm. And that's why I think the most fun alternate history everybody knows, and the one that's I think is fascinating with how well thought out it is Kaiserreich, is the Kaiserreich mod for Hearts of Iron, right?
I've never played it.
It's fascinating. Like one of the most fun thing, in a way, it is very LARPy. It's because you have Roman von Sternberg, the psychopathic guy from Russia that tried to restart the Mongol Empire, but then the communists killed him. It's like, well, what if he actually lived and just took control of Mongolia? But you also have like Hermann Goering is like the governor of the giant German state in Africa. But sorry if I like extended this too long, but
No problem.
So for me, you know, as I said in the beginning, kind of my goal on the stream was, you know, kind of to present, you know, the thesis that the real target of the cathedral, like what the main target is the church, is Christianity, is God, and is pretty much any general sense of authority that's dependent on God. And therefore, any right-wing reactionary movement has to ultimately. Oh, sorry, that might be on my end.
Sorry,
but ultimately, any Christian, any reactionary response to the cathedral has to be a religious and specifically Christian response. And we can do that by practicing, daily prayer, asceticism, whether that's pious mortifications, acts of charity, donations, and obviously avoiding, stuff like pornography in our own lives. And I also wanted to, I'm going to drop a link in the chat to the book, I mentioned several times, The Crisis of Modernity by Augusto de Noche. If anyone watching this is interested in reading it, it's a pretty dense philosophical work, but I think it's kind of the best explanation of communism, Marxism, and modernism in general that you're gonna get. So dropping it in the chat now. So yeah, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. And everyone watching, please do make sure you subscribe to everyone here, especially Benedict. He's very undersubbed and he makes very good work. But Fritz and Charlemagne too.
Don't worry, I'm oversubbed. I don't make enough content. I want to make more. I'm just trying to get back into that habit. I do stream on Twitch now, but
yeah,
I'm planning on that. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, just make sure to check that all out. No, if there's anything else you want to say, Fritz, that's cool.
No.
Okay. Yeah, no, and also, of course, make sure to subscribe to Settlers Lament, too. And yeah, thank you, everyone, and goodbye. Have a good day.
Go with God.
Yeah.